I think we'll get started. So thank you everyone who's joining online and in person for our Research Spotlight talk with Dr. Bryndl Hohmann-Marriott. We begin by acknowledging that the WHRI operates on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Further, this acknowledgement, gratitude, and respect extends to all the First Nations communities on whose traditional territories the WHRI builds relationships. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Hohmann-Marriott to Vancouver and to the WHRI. Dr. Hohmann-Marriott is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Otago in New Zealand. She is co-founder and co-director of the Center for Menstrual Cycle Research and the Menstrual Health Research Network. Today, Dr. Hohmann-Marriott will discuss menstrual cycle tracking apps and patient-generated data. Before we begin, in-person attendees, press the button on your microphone to activate it during the Q&A. For online participants, please raise your hand and unmute yourself or submit your questions via the chat. The communications team will ensure all questions are relayed to the speaker. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Bryndl Hohmann-Marriott.
Oh, I'm not quite tall enough to peek over here, so I'll keep stepping over here, but thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here and getting a bit to share what I've been working on and the center. And yeah, hopefully here are some of your questions and things that you're interested in. They asked me to put together some learning objectives. So here's some of the things that we'll be hopefully talking about. So looking at the functions of period tracking apps and specifically the types of digital data that are collected by apps and how functional these apps might be for diagnosis and management of menstrual cycle related diseases and disorders. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Center for Menstrual Cycle Research. So that's the context that I do my work in. But first, a little bit about me. So I'll start with my pepeha, which is the Maori introduction. And so it goes through a little bit about people's backgrounds and who they are to share with you. And I've got a little bit more about where we're from. But I'll start by saying, Tiniko te katoa, ko wera timana, te whakapaparanga mai, ko wasa te whenua tupu, ko o te poti, aoi no hoana. Kai te mahi o tātou whakaiku wata, ko Bryndl Hohmann-Marriott ingoa. So that means that I hail from, originally from places like Wales and Germany, but did grow up in the US before I moved to Otipoti, Dunedin, and working at the University of Otago. My background and training is in sociology and demography. So all different methods. I'm actually a real methods geek. So quantitative, qualitative, social science research methods, I love them all. So I'll tell you, I'm not going to go too deep into the methods with the research I'm talking about, but anybody who has a methods question, I would love that. Is the microphone catching it? Yeah. Okay. I can try to move around a little closer to where it is. I know, I'm really not tall. So just here a little bit about where I'm located, right? So here you can kind of see where we are here. And if you look all the way clear on the other side of the map, we're actually not that close. If it was a different map, they'd all be wrapped around. You can kind of see where Dunedin is, and we are all the way at the bottom of New Zealand. So actually the climate's quite similar to here, maybe a little less rainy, but very similar. So we're going to be talking about menstrual cycles, and I don't need to tell you that they're important and that they are impacting every part of every system, and everybody with menstrual cycles, is going through. I think the important thing to remember here with what we're talking about is a lot of people hear menstrual cycles and they focus on the menstruation part. Right? So we're not talking just about the bleeding, we're talking about the entire cycle. So everybody's with menstrual cycles is always going through them. And obviously they've got far more, we also focus a lot on the reproductive aspect of it, but they have far more implications beyond reproduction. And the other thing is we often focus on the biology of it, but of course the entire context experienced by people changes how they experience their cycles, how they're understood, all of that. So, which is why we've got a lot of collaborations across multiple disciplines. As you can imagine, this is a really exciting space to be bridging disciplines. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of my colleagues working on this. Because as we realized that we really need to have a multidisciplinary perspective on understanding menstrual cycles, And also, we really need to bring in lived experiences, patient voices, clinician voices, educators and policymakers, and all the people around that are working on this. We started, the co-founder and I, Professor Jane Gerling, started the Menstrual Health Research Network with a whole bunch of other people. And that grew and developed until this year, we've launched the Center for Menstrual Cycle Research. So we're keeping the network as a broad collective, and then the center is a little bit more of a focused group, but we all do things together. So our aim, and this is something that we worked really a long time with all the center members, or all the network members to develop, is improving mental, physical, spiritual aura of all those who have had or had menstrual cycles and their communities. And our focus is Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also across the Pacific. And as you can see, here we are, we're making connections across the world as well. And the main focus of particularly the network, but also the center, is whakapurungatanga. So that means building relationships. And we want to promote and facilitate that research, right? Because as we all know, women's health is a little under-researched. So this is one of those areas that we really hope to be able to contribute by encompassing those multiple knowledges and multiple disciplines. Right. So like I said, we established the network, and then we established the center. Anybody who wants to, that came out really small, but anybody who wants to find out a little bit more, menstrualhealthresearch.com, and you'll see our beautiful identifier. Miriam Parker Bowles drew that for us, and you can find out a little bit more about what our network and center does. And we've got I'll tell you a little bit more on the next page about what they do, but I want to acknowledge our steering committee, in particular, Professor Jane Gerling, but also Peta and Josie, who are our current steering committee. So these are just a few little pictures of us from our WHRI, which is one of our main events. It's like a little a conference. And so we have every year, we've got a 2-day WHRI where the real objective is to get everybody connecting, talking with each other. And we bring in not only all the different expertise, but all, experts from researchers, but also community members, lived experience, experts in Māori health, Pacific Islands health, trans non-binary health, disability health, just a whole lot of different ways of understanding menstrual cycle related all the things. We also have a monthly seminar online. So if you sign up, that's something that actually, given the time difference, we usually have it in mornings. So it'll probably be afternoons here. It actually might work out pretty well. So if you sign up for that one, you can get on our mailing list and find out about the different topics we have there. We also are working as the center now to develop more community-based events. So that's something that's really exciting. We're expanding into as well. From our center application, Jane put together all the different specialties people wrote down. So, this is just, you don't have to read them all, but it's just sort of a bit of an idea of the range of things that people talk about or that are experts in for those core center members. And of course, the network extends far beyond, so it even goes well beyond that. And just a little bit more about Jane. She put this together about herself for another talk about the center, but I thought this is a good indication of, so she's in the Department of Anatomy at University of Otago. So again, we've got that social and biological sciences collaborating, which is what we were aiming for with the co-directing. Right. Does anybody have questions about the center before I start talking about specific research projects? I'm more than happy to talk about our center or network or all the things that we do afterwards as well. So just let me know. All right. Then I'm just going to move on a little bit and talk about my cycle data project. And of course, there's a million people I could thank about for this one. There's so many people involved in this, but in particular, Jane, Anna, and Mike, also Pera Ari, and participants, and again, quite a number of people who helped with this. This is three different research projects are the ones I'm going to be talking about particularly today. I'll give you some more citations. I've written about each of them. The most recent one, there's still a couple of publications in progress, but there should be quite a bit out there if you want to know a little bit more about any of these. So I'm going to be kind of picking and choosing just to kind of get a little bit more about this. But I'll talk a little bit more about the data collection part of this project. But I want to start first of all about why we talked about why menstrual cycles are important, but I wanted to talk about why data is important to think about. And what we've seen is something that's been described as the informatization of medicine, right? So more and more data is being collected, more and more data is going into the process of diagnosis, treatment, management, every aspect of healthcare. And we often will think about the medically mediated sources more and more tests, more scans, more information that we can get, which is, well, it's a double-edged sword often. But what I want to focus on today is patient-generated tracking data, which sometimes is called self-tracking. And it can be thought of more broadly if we think about the quantified self. There's a lot of literature on that in theory, thinking about the quantified self and how people think of themselves as datafied objects, which we'll get into why that, again, the upsides and the downsides of that. But increasingly, that datafication of self is happening via apps, right? And we'll talk about different ways that apps are developed. But if we think about menstrual cycles and apps, then that gets us to menstrual cycle tracking apps. We've probably all seen a number of these. What I'm going to focus on today, because there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these apps. So just to keep the focus to something that makes it make sense, I'm going to focus on calendar-based apps. And that is the majority of the apps. There are other apps that are based on fertility awareness-based methods of cycle tracking, contraception. I will mention those later where they really stand out, but the focus for this talk is really about the calendar-based apps, because that's typically going to be what people download and use on an ordinary basis. And again, hundreds of apps, hundreds of millions of downloads. These things are very, very, very widely used. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about why. There's been some research done on the downloads, and so that was really, really clear that the most downloaded apps were Flow and Clue. It's a third one that's that's like far, far behind those. And then all the rest of them have, again, multiple downloads, but these are the two really, really big ones. These two are both standalone apps, right? So they're just themselves, but there are also apps that are a little harder to measure downloads or use. But for example, Apple Health, which didn't start out offering a menstrual cycle tracking function, offered every other function in the world. You can measure your magnesium levels, you can measure everything because those are important and necessary, but period tracking, no one thought of that. They did add that recently. So people are using Apple Health, which is integrated into a lot of things. Fitbit will track periods, etc. But then there's also trackers that are integrated into other systems like health insurers. It's a whole nother, we'll talk more about data and where it goes in a little bit, but just to know that there's many different ways that people access these different trackers. The vast majority of them, and again, if we think about how many are downloaded and used, most people are using commercial or for-profit apps. There are a few, they're hard to find, but they exist, that are nonprofit or developed by agencies or government agencies, health departments, kind of things. There are also a few that have some clinical component right from the get-go, or some co-development with patients right from the get-go. Vanishingly small. They do exist. I don't want to minimize their importance, but that's not what most people are accessing. Right? The reality is that the big bucks and the big advertisements. So I search for this stuff a lot, and the number of advertisements for Flow I get is just unreal. So anybody searching for this is going to find advertisements mainly for the ones that have the money to do that. So it's just a little bit about what they are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about their functions next. And I want just to kind of help the flow of this, I've tried to kind of organize things into some benefits and risks. So I'll be putting the benefits in blue and the risks in red. And this is obviously, as always, a slight oversimplification. I think you'll see where I'm going with these, but if anybody has questions about any of them, and there's a lot to unpack with every aspect of this, but just so you can kind of follow the through lines, the benefits are blue and the risks are red. So I'll start by talking about some of the reasons people use these. Again, they're really widely downloaded. This was what first got me into this research, is thinking, okay, why are people actually using these? Because they are very, very popular for people, and then people just do continue using them when they do. Not saying that people do stop and start and use different ones and find the ones that work for them. But there's a pretty high, people that I talk to in the research keep telling me how easy they are to use. Right? So how do they work? Well, the main way is user enters some data, right? Almost all of these apps will take dates of menstruation, right? That's the key. Makes sense. And we'll see what they extrapolate from there. But that you can add other physiological characteristics, temperature, cervical mucus, et cetera, et cetera. Also signs and symptoms that go along with it, pain, mood, bowel movements, et cetera, or activities that people are engaging in. A lot of them will measure sexual activity, contraceptive use, nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going et cetera, a lot with these because, again, every app is a little different and they keep changing all the time, right? So how they measure these, part of the challenge is really understanding how they're measuring any of these signs and symptoms or what algorithm they have underneath it. And we'll talk about that just a little bit because things keep changing and because there's so many of these. So a lot of these are sort of a little overgeneralized, I'm sorry, but I have gotten into a little bit more specifics about the two main ones. So if anyone has questions about Flow or Clue, I do know a little bit more about those. Okay, so that's what the user enters into the app, right? The app shows the user their data that they've entered summarized, all right? Typically, they'll show little icons on a calendar, or they'll show cycle views, or they'll show a chart view. Again, the main focus for a lot of these is cycle length and regularity. And sometimes, often, they'll map symptoms onto cycle phases, because this is typically what users are looking for with using these apps. The next one is what I think is some of the most interesting things that the apps do and some of the hardest to evaluate. And I'll talk more about evaluation on the next page. The apps use these data to calculate what they call predictions, and I'm calling estimates or inferences. Right. So a lot of people want to know when their next menstrual period is going to be. And many of these apps, most of them, will calculate the next menstrual period, sometimes up, years in advance. Right? We'll get to that. They will also estimate a date of ovulation, right? Often will estimate a fertile window. These can often be turned on or off. But the function is there. They will estimate the possibility of a pregnancy. They will estimate the newest thing that they're starting to offer users is pre-diagnoses. Right? You may have PCOS, PMOS. Now, so you may have, you might be at risk of these different things. Right? We will get into that in just a sec, because there's a big risk with all of these estimates that the apps are making, right? How accurate are they? Right? How useful are these? What information are people getting? We'll talk more about how people understand their apps when I get into more of our data about our participants. But it's really difficult to evaluate any of these apps because all those algorithms are proprietary. It's so hard to find information about the algorithms, right? Also, they're constantly changing, right? Which is, on the one hand, great. Updates are good. This is responsive. That's what they should be doing. However, it makes it really hard to study them. And a rather large proportion of the research on any of these apps are teams that, when you kind of peel back the layers, the teams are associated with the apps. Right? That's how you get the data from the apps. I totally understand that, but it does make it kind of hard to get independent evaluations. There have been some independent evaluations, though, and again, with the caveat that over the years things do change. But if we look broadly at these independent evaluations, my assessment of that is that they consistently find that apps aren't particularly accurate, or definitely not accurate enough for contraceptive use, which is, again, what first got me into this, was thinking people are using these, again, calendar-based apps for contraceptive purposes. Again, it's thinking about what is the value people find in this? And again, it really gets down to fertility intentions. That's important, but I'm not going to get into that research right now. But I will say, again, this is where the big exception for apps using established methods really absolutely shows through. The users are very different, talk about their apps very differently. The apps function very differently. And that's a whole different evidence base as well. As you can imagine, the apps are also particularly problematic for irregular cycles, and this is something that they are aware of. And when you do see updates and trying to improve the algorithms, it's often about improving accuracy for irregular cycles, which fair enough, right? However, let's just say that although it's really clear that inaccuracy is a risk, app promotional material is probably a little less forthcoming about potential for risk and inaccuracy. So, all right. Now, the other thing that we all think about, and we've all been thinking about more in recent years, when I started out doing this research, I was like, oh, well, you don't know where the data is going. And I felt so paranoid. And this has become much more a part of the conversation, so it's a lot easier to talk about. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I'd really rather not have it be much more a part of the conversation. But we have to remember, not only is all the data that apps are collecting out, in part of their data collection, and again, some of the apps have reasonable data security. Other apps have terrible data security, and there have been different evaluations of that. Sometimes you can see, literally, in the metadata, what people are writing in like open fields, things like that. But look, the metadata of people that are downloading the apps, the fact that you have downloaded the app is widely available, right? So that's already a piece of information about you that's out there. Every app, we've all done this, right? You get an app, you download it, it asks you to agree to terms and conditions, right? And typically those terms and conditions allow it a lot of access to other things on your mobile device, right? A particular location, what other apps you have, sometimes your contacts, things like that, right? And it is physically impossible for anyone to read through all of the terms and conditions for all the apps that we need to use and all the websites and all the things. Like, they are so long, people have estimated how long it would take to read these. So it is not humanly possible to read everything, let alone the fact that there are loopholes big enough to drive trucks through, and I'll show you one of the key ones in just a sec. So that's security. But then there's also privacy, which is a completely different issue. And so the security is leaking or stealing data, but apps themselves might not keep the data private, right? They might share the data, they might sell the data, right? They might promise not to share or sell data, but here's the loophole big enough to drive the truck through. They make inferences, and they never promise not to share or sell those inferences. Actually, they want to keep your data really, really safe. They don't want anybody else getting that data. That's gold, right? So that's where the money is, right? So apps make these inferences, like we talked about with the functions of the apps, right? What phase of the cycle are you in, right? Do we want to market chocolate to you or not, right? What pre-diagnoses are they offering you? Right? Is there a suspected pregnancy? Did that suspected pregnancy disappear? So I want to tell you a story about that one, right? So this is Talia Shadwell, and she was using a period tracker app and just, ordinarily using it. And noticed one day that on Facebook, she started getting a lot of ads for baby stuff, right? And she reckoned it was just because she was sort of in that age where, friends with having babies, she was associating with people with babies, baby stuff was just popping up, whatever. Until, a few weeks down the line, she opens up her period tracking app and realizes, oh yeah, I forgot to put in the last time I had a period. Put in her period, the ads disappeared. So you can read about her. She wrote all about her experience there. But if we look more broadly, right? So we know that apps infer pregnancy status, right? So they take the data about period length and menstruation, right? And remember, that app is not selling, sharing, leaking that data, but they are sharing that inference about, hey, look, there might be a pregnancy here, right? And we know that that app inference might not be correct, right? So if someone has a late period, according to this app, sure, maybe they're pregnant, but maybe the user just didn't enter that period, like Talia, right? Or maybe the app was incorrectly estimating cycle length. Remember, even the apps know that they're not necessarily accurate in terms of people with irregular cycles, right? But the app is still inferring that that period is late and that a pregnancy might be happening, right? So why do they make these inferences? Well, ostensibly it's to add to the value of the app for the user, but it's also really valuable for the app, right? So the app might want to use this information, these inferences, to retain the user or upsell them to a paid version, right? So a lot of apps will have sort of freemium models where you start out free, but they upsell you into the premium model. Advertisers, right? A pregnant person is extremely valuable to an advertiser because pregnancy is a time when a lot of purchasing decisions change, right? So people will buy new things, they'll make new habits. And so advertisers want to get right in there. The absolute first moment, they want to be the first one in there, putting some things in your eyeballs to change your buying decisions. Do these work? We don't know. That's a completely different field of study, but they want to do it so they'll pay for the information. And then also, governments can and do buy data sets and digital information. It's a real workaround to get information extrajudicially. So there's a lot of data compilers which will compile all this information and happily sell it. And so any place where miscarriage ends up being criminalized, this is a real worry because, again, not accurate, right? So this is a good example of where that data and where it goes is a huge risk. All right, if you want to read more about this, this report just came out last year. I highly recommend it. They do a great job of showing the structural framing of why this is, why this data is really problematic to collect and share. So I did not write that. It's completely independent. I didn't write it. I just read it. I mean, I read it, but I think they did a really, really, really good job of summarizing the key issues. All right, I wanted to turn now to our participants and what they had to say about apps. So we're going to focus a little bit more on New Zealand, but I think that what they're saying is going to apply to a lot of different places. What I did with my research that's a little bit different than other app research out there is focusing on the medical information collected or the medical uses of the information collected in these apps. And I wanted to bring together a really interdisciplinary team to understand it as well. So since 2018, I've conducted a few different studies, mainly focusing on app users, but the one in the middle that had some qualitative surveys and focus groups also included clinicians and advocates, app developers, and a little more broad. And my most recent one ran a little pilot where app users were comparing their app with an at-home urine-based hormone test. So that was really fun. All right, overall, what I consistently find is that app users and patients are hoping that their app data will help them, right? They're hoping that it will help them with planning and preventing pregnancy. They're hoping it will help them identify issues that are linked to their menstrual cycles. They hope that it'll help them communicate with clinicians. They really have a lot of high expectations for this data that they're collecting. We'll see if that lives up to the high expectations, right? But a big thing keeps coming up, and this is, again, why people keep using this, is it's very convenient, right? And I love the way this participant put it. It remembers, right? Her app remembers. So although she can quickly forget, how much time has passed since her last period, the app remembers, right? So this is really, and I've gone in more depth and asked users, okay, well, why not just paper and pencil? Right? Because good old calendar is a really good method. And people just say they forget to do that, right? So an app just kind of pokes them in the hip and says, hey, enter some data. So although on the one hand, some apps can get a little bit annoying doing that, a little bit of a reminder, a little bit something that's really easy. As soon as you remember that you forgot to do it, you can just kind of whip your phone out and put it in. And so when people really need this information, right, that might be a trade-off that's worth making. Right. However, what we find are by using an app to collect this information, the app then tries to insert itself between a user and their own body. And this is something that the app users are experiencing, but this is also something that I'm looking at sort of app promotional material and what apps are indicating to the users. The apps are deliberately trying to say, hey, it's you and me against that over there. And so the app users end up feeling not well supported by the apps, right? So like this one is, so one person was saying, okay, the app is wording, healthy users, median average of healthy users. And this person is recognizing, oh, I'm outside those lines, so I'm obviously an unhealthy user. Or someone else was saying, okay, I'm already worried, but the app made me more anxious because I'm reminded I'm not like the textbook, right? So stress where there was already stress, right? So again, we have this sort of iatrogenic harm through using these apps as a potential, right? So not everyone, consistently people found like the data collection part of the apps and the data, where the app summarized data that the users entered to be particularly helpful. Anything that the app was adding on top of that, that's where things got a lot of, it's much more mixed value and quite a few negative statements about that. Right. So again, here's that keeping a record. So a lot of positive things about keeping a record. And in particular, I was talking with the participants about how they communicated with clinicians. And you'll notice some of this is things that they've done, and for some of this is things, again, that they hope it can do or wish that it would do. So these first two quotes are from that middle study that was the qualitative survey. So I had clinicians as well. And so someone wrote in literally, as a doctor, it gives me an objective record, which I think is really interesting. So both the patient and a doctor were saying, this feels like an objective record. Again, remember, this is patient entry. This is patient collected data, but it feels objective because it's on an app, which I think is fascinating, right? But it is a record. Hopefully a paper record would feel as objective, but I'm not so sure about that, right? So patients collecting this data feel like if it's something they can put their phone on the doctor's desk and say, look, here's my history. Make of it what you will, right? And quite a few people talked about that long, long time to diagnosis. And we all know things like endo take far, far too long to diagnose, right? So there's a lot of people trying to use this to shorten that time to diagnosis, really hoping that this will help. They're really hoping this will help the next generation as well, right? So again, if we think about their concerns are extremely real, extremely valid. Right? Not 100% certain this is the answer to their concerns, but the concerns are absolutely valid. Okay. Here's why I'm not so sure this is the answer to their concerns, because it doesn't always work the way they hope. Right? And again, we have that clinician saying, yes, this is objective data. Again, I wish they'd just believe patients, but here we are. But I had stories as well of people taking the data in and having it not be particularly well appreciated. And again, I'm not entirely certain about what data this was, what form it was collected. So that's kind of the next thing I want to go in a little more detail, is talking with clinicians about what kind of data would they find valuable, right? Because like I said, these apps constantly are changing how they collect data. Symptoms. The way the apps are measuring symptoms is not necessarily the way the clinicians need the symptoms measured. Right? So the apps are measuring symptoms in a way that's easy for users to put in, but I don't know how valuable they are. Right? The other problem here, again, possibly because of this high hope, possibly because of app promotional material, app users tend to be very overconfident about those app estimates. Right? They use words like pinpointing or literally accurate. Right? And look, for them and their cycles, again, there's some things that we can objectively confirm. You know when you're bleeding, so you can see if the app is accurate about that, right? Things like ovulation, this is why I find it much more interesting to look at ovulation. Takes a little bit more knowledge to understand when ovulation is happening, and it's usually things that the app is not measuring, right? So, but people are saying the apps are measuring ovulation accurately, because the apps call themselves an ovulation tracker. Literally what they call themselves when you try to download them, ovulation tracker. I can talk more about that. Clinicians, on the other hand, express a lot more caution about those estimates. Right? So saying there's a lot more we need to know, and ovulation can obviously be a lot more, doesn't really always happen when we think it's happening. And so we do get very different evaluations or expressions of confidence from clinicians. So that was actually quite a difference. So overall, if we think about how app users are talking about their use of the apps? How do they imagine their apps and how do they imagine their data? So I've been working with this theory of an imaginary. And we're all kind of developing an imaginary of apps and data right now, right? What is this data and what does it mean, right? And one of the things that I'm finding talking with app users is again, that hope. They hope that the app data can intervene. They hope that it can help through every stage of their healthcare. They do tend to see apps as sort of flawless, right? So any flaws that come in are because of their own body and their own behaviors, right? And apps will actually describe themselves this way, right? They'll say, this app is very accurate, but if your cycles are irregular or you're not entering data regularly, right? Putting it all on the user. So app users feel that because that's the impression that they're getting, right? However, they really resist that app positioning itself between them and their body, right? People know I'm my body. This is not a different, separate thing, right? But the app is kind of sidling in there going, it's me and you against that flawed thing over there. App users are not having to borrow that, right? They are not going to go there, which is great. So the app can be a tool, but they're not seeing it as an ally. So thinking about how they're imagining this app and how they're using it can really help us see how they want to use it, how they want to collect the data, use the data, understand it. If I had to kind of give an overview, again, like I said, blue and red here, I'd say that data collection, just the balls, these are the basics of the cycle. This is how it can be just mapped on or charted. That can be useful for somebody with a million things going on that just needs this basic information so that they can have a good, solid conversation with their clinician, right? So it can be helpful for communicating with clinicians for that part of the data, right? I haven't talked as much about that because I've been focusing on diagnosis right now, but management can be another way people talk about knowing what's happening with their cycle, knowing what phase they're in can help them manage various conditions. PMDD comes to mind. So there are some ways that it can help with that as well. Maybe as people are tracking their data, they can be aware of things like, oh, I didn't realize that my cycles were irregular. Oh, I didn't realize that this was connected to this part of the cycle. Right. So again, that user awareness. I'm not so convinced about the value of things that the app is telling the user, right? Again, sometimes it does flag things like, oh, look, it looks a little bit irregular here, or other things. Maybe different apps have different ways of doing it. Maybe there's some that are helpful, but that's a little mixed, right? On the other hand, here's some real solid risks, right? Inaccurate estimates, right, can be a real problem. In particular, apps inaccurately saying when ovulation is can be a real problem. People can think they're ovulating when they're not. People can be ovulating when they think they're not, et cetera. You can imagine all the different things that can happen there. This can happen for more than just ovulation as well. The apps try to kind of get themselves in there and offer healthcare information, et cetera. Maybe if there's not really complex issues going on, maybe, but the people I'm talking with are turning to these apps because there's all sorts of information that they would like to get to really understand what's going on with their bodies. Actual talking with a clinician, actual healthcare, actual time to really unpack that is obviously going to be much, much more useful. And we've got all those data risks, right? So it's weighing those up. And part of the reason that I turn my focus to people who are trying to understand, diagnose, and manage complex conditions that's maybe one of those places where you can maybe argue that the risk outweighs, the benefit outweighs the risk. I think for any average use, I'm not sure I'd say that the risk outweighs the benefit, but people need to make their own evaluation of that, but understanding what all the risks are is really a key part of that. So yeah, if you want to read a little bit more about any of these are my more recent publications about the studies that I was just talking about. Like I said, there's a couple more that are in progress right now, but you'll find heaps more information about the method and lots more. Some of my favorite quotes are in these. So there's a lot more going on with any of these any of these studies. So hopefully, and I can, can share any of these with you if you want, but it's pretty easy to put my name in and it'll pop up. So hopefully, this has given you at least the basics of the functions of period tracking apps, hopefully a little bit more than you knew already. Types of digital data and what happens with that digital data, and a little bit more about how it can be useful for diagnosis and management. And I'm more than happy to answer questions about any aspect of that, because like I said, this was really just a not enough time to get into all the things, but hopefully a good chance to think about each of these parts. So yeah, thank you very much.